And sorry, everyone, bear with me. I have a little bit of a welcome to read, just to bring everybody onto the same page of how we got here and where we are. So I think everybody knows me as a village trustee and the liaison to the planning board and zoning boards. And I'd like to thank everyone for participating tonight. And I'd like to especially thank the members of the planning board and zoning board for all the time and effort that they spend as volunteers in service of this village. About 25 years ago, the village board, working in concert with—
This is a volunteer position?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
A board volunteer.
Sorry.
So the village board, working in concert with a dedicated group of concerned citizens and donors, raised $150,000 in private donations to fund a new master plan and zoning code for the village of Pawling. The village hired world-renowned planner Andreas Duani, as well as a firm of Buckhorst Fish and I'm gonna butcher this. Jacquemart. Several years of work, which included dozens of meetings and various boards, citizens, and consultants, led the enactment of the new master plan and zoning code, including urban regulations. This plan and code has served as a positive guiding force for the village over the past 25 years. In my view, it is a big part of the reason why the village has experienced such positive development over the past several years, including a village green, which has become a magnet for tourism, and new retail stores, and a new railroad station that avoided the high-level platform look found to the south of us, and serves as a model for other Harlem Valley communities. Our hope is that we can continue to work together and foster positive growth in our very special village. Recently, in connection with different development projects that come before the village, questions have arisen about the intent of the urban regulations relative to certain other provisions of the code, including the bulk schedule. For this reason, the village board decided to address these issues in collaborative manner with all three boards by going to Frank Fish of BFJ. Frank worked with Andreas Duani every step of the way in the development of the urban regs and associated code, and is well positioned to help us understand the intent of the urban regulations as they pertain to other sections of the code. And before I welcome Frank, I would just like to say we have a very large agenda tonight. And I think to make sure that everyone hears Frank's presentation, I would like to suggest that we allow Frank to go through his presentation, which is items number 1 through 9, and then we can open it up for a small window of questions and answers. And then at that point, if time allows, we will move on to what's in the items, or the items in number 10. After that, I'm sure there will be additional questions and comments, and I would suggest that those be sent in by email to Jen Osborne or to myself, and we can compile all of that and then send them off to Frank for him to address that way. So that's what I would like to move forward with. So it's my pleasure to welcome Frank Fish, and thank you, everyone.
Lauri, thank you. Just a brief word on history as we get into this. I did work, as Lauri just mentioned, with Andres some 26, 25 years ago. And it was a real 2 to 3 year effort. And I do notice in the on the call, I think 2 people who can correct me if I say something wrong about the history, and that's Nancy Tanner and Earl Slocum. And there may be others on this call that were very involved, but I happen to remember both Nancy and Earl and see them here tonight. I do want to I was asked, I came to a trustee meeting, as the trustees know, a month ago or so, and we had a discussion of just what Lauri said, was could I provide some meeting perspective, or the perspective of those who develop the plan, talk about the regulations, the urban regulations, and how they might or might not relate to the standard zoning code or your zoning code. So that's what items 1 through 9 are about. I hope everyone has the agenda. I presume you all got a copy of the agenda. I know that was sent out yesterday. But as I go through it, I'll tell you what what agenda item I'm on. So I just want to briefly also mention that Taylor, who's a project planner in our office, a senior planner, is here on the call, and where I have a couple of just points to make on the old plan. I'm hoping Taylor can share his screen, and we'll just show a few graphics on this. But just item 2 on the agenda is really to provide what's the purpose of this meeting. Lauri has gone over, but it's what I was asked is provide an historical perspective on the development of the 1994 comprehensive plan and the urban regulations, and then their relationship to the zoning code. Because after they were done, I think David and I spent 4 to 6 months trying to get that code, after the plan was adopted, integrated into your zoning code. And I just want to mention that the plan you have, I believe, if not the first, is one of the first urban codes, which is called, in today's parlance in planning, form-based zoning. And Andres Dwani was a pioneer in that. And so, that being the first one, or one of the first in New York State, you can imagine that as you fit it into a zoning code, and you're doing that, one of the first models in the state, you might not always get it perfect. And I think that's what you're running into perhaps now, that there's some gray areas between the plan as developed by Andres and us and your current code. So that's the meaning of purpose. The purpose of the meeting tonight is, can I give a little context of those possible conflicts, and then with you discuss what those are. And I think also Chairman of the Planning Board sent some issues, and I added those as item 10, examples of what some of those might be for discussion. So that's the purpose of the meeting. And so I'll just discuss perhaps the master plan to start with, and also tell you that since this was developed, there have been numerous other communities in New York State where we've developed this form-based code. We did one 3 years ago in New Rochelle, 2 years ago in Mount Kisco, and now we're working on one in Ossining. And in a lot of the cases, they're what I call a hybrid code. That is, it's not all just the urban regulations, because your urban regulations, they were put in to the zoning code itself, as you know. So you have a combination of both the urban regulations and the code. But I did want to just go back to that master plan of 1994. I actually, our office had I actually have my own copy of it that I saved, and I think some of you may have it. But what was unique about it, New York State law suggests, it doesn't mandate anything when you do a comprehensive plan, but it suggests having about 10 to a dozen chapters because of the words of the New York State law. And those are covered in the plan. So what you have in New York State were covered in the plan. But there's a uniqueness in the plan, and it has to do with Chapter 8, the development parcels. And included in the development parcels is things like the Village Center and Green, the East Main Street and Coulter Ave, Route 22, the Johnson parcel, Granton Cells, and the Umshed parcel, I hope I didn't mispronounce that. But Andres's view was, let's work on this plan, not only with the topography of the land and the environment, but with the property owners, with the owners themselves, so that he could develop a plan that related to the environment, related to the built context around it, and also would last because it was developed with the knowledge, not only the knowledge, but in some cases the participation of those landowners. So, for instance, the Village Green. In the plan, I don't know, Taylor, if you can share your screen for a moment. See if this works. So there's, the original Village Green concept of Andres Duani, and you've achieved part of it. And also, we did drawings of the train station to get the train station, and Metro North actually did do a slanted roof as opposed to their, their normal flat roof. So you've got some things out of this from these drawings that happened. He was very interested in the public places, in the public square. Now, obviously, you didn't achieve all of this. It's not easy to achieve when you need parking. So, but you did achieve some of these things. And then East Main and Coulter, this next slide, was just his drawing of what he envisioned and could envision in that place. And then on Route 22, this next drawing, I think is just a concept on Route 22. Now, I don't think the pond is still there. When I came up to Pawling, to meet with the trustees, I looked for it. I didn't see it. But at any rate, he drew this in, and you can see what his drawing was for the old Johnson parcel on Route 22. And he tried to do things so that, again, his idea was the form and the design of it, and so that it fit in with the context of what was around it. And then the next one, I think, is another Johnson parcel. And I wanted to show these because both Johnson, Grant, and Sells and Umshed, because we weren't trying to dictate anything. We had as you can see here, two different schemes. We came up for 3 and 4 day charrettes. We called them charrettes, sort of just a design workshop. They were all day. And we went through with the property owners, with village residents, what could be some acceptable designs. Scheme A here is just, it shows something you could do, what we would call as of right. And then Scheme B, we're developing more open space in it, trying to work with the topography and get open space, sometimes called a sort of a cluster subdivision or an open space subdivision. And Andres did this for Grant and Sells, as you can see here, and then the next one is the Umshed property. And so he did different options, worked them out, and then those got put into the plan itself. They're in the plan today. So that was the concept. And then the question was, well, how do you regulate these so that they happen? So he came up with the urban regulations, and I wanted to just spend a brief moment on form-based zoning, sort of item 4 on the agenda, if you're looking at the agenda. And that is, what is it? What is form-based zoning? Andres was, I would say, a true believer in the form-based idea. What it is it's not trying to control the use of the property as much as it is how is the form, the built envelope of the development, the design of it. So that's what he was trying to do. And that form-based idea has caught on throughout some municipalities in New York State and throughout the country. And you can see here the dot points I listed. It has to do with building placement. It has to do then, as you know, in the plan and in your code, are then design guidelines for the homes themselves that get built, and then landscape guidelines. So it was all about form and design. It was not about, which is item 5, it's not about as much the use of the site, although sometimes a form-based design will tell you occasionally, you don't want an industrial use, or you want to limit retail, for instance. But generally, it's not about use. It's about the design of it. They'll have height many times in the form-based code. But one thing they rarely ever have is FAR, or floor area ratio, things that control density. And they rarely have ideas like just what Euclidean zoning, by the way, got its name from a Supreme Court case, Amber v. Euclid, in which the court said, yeah, it's okay for the state, for the government or the local municipality to separate uses. Form-based is the opposite of separating the uses. Form-based is allowing multiple uses usually, and occasionally it is only residential, like on some of the development parcels I showed, but it's not primarily about use, nor is it about density in the sense of FAR. It's about density in the sense of height and how things relate to the environment. So there's a slight difference between form-based and your area and bulk regulations, which you're probably all used to, the area and bulk code. And Taylor, I think, is the next one. Does the next one? Yeah, it shows an example here of what Andres developed. By the way, he developed 6 use types. I just picked one, just an example. What he's trying to show in the gray area here, the building placement, the section that's gray, it's not that that's a building necessarily. It's just a building will go in that location somewhere in the gray area. And then the parking, he's not saying that there should be that many parking spots. It's just parking should go in there. So he's trying to place the building, if you will. And then some of the other schemes here about where to place landscaping and where to place parking and services. And then the cut-throughs there on building use, building height are just that. They get at height. Now, in this one case, he's suggesting here that retail be controlled. It's not allowed as a primary use. So in his mind, it could be allowed, or in our parlance that you all would use, I think, or I would use, it could be allowed by a special permit, or it could be allowed as an accessory use. That was Andres's. So he didn't focus as much on the details of the area and bulk schedule. Taylor, I think the next one is your area and bulk, Schedule C. And, Schedule C, this is not usually found in a form-based code. So what you've got is the master plan from 1994, with its urban regulations, the architectural or design guidelines and landscape guidelines, but it was put into a zoning code, which David and Daniels and I worked on a bit before it was adopted and approved. And then, so you've got what I call a hybrid code. You've got the regulations that were now 25 years, 26 years old, and you also have the area and bulk schedule. Well, the regulations, for instance, are silent on a thing like floor area ratio. They're usually silent. The new urbanists, I call them, the form-based coders, also don't usually get into parking very much. So here you have the area and bulk schedule that controls those things. So a question comes up because your code has the note that where there are gray areas, if there's a conflict between the urban regulations and your code, the urban regulations prevail. That creates a little bit of what I call a gray area. Not everything's black and white. And we give you an example, and that is if you look at item 7, I've got some examples of conflict in the regs. What if there's no urban regulation? There is no urban regulation on floor area ratio. So if there is none, then does the area bulk schedule prevail? I would think most outside planners would look at this, if they were looking at this, and say, well, yes, the urban regulation doesn't address it, therefore you look at the area and bulk schedule. However, that I understand from the brief meeting I had with the trustees, that one's unclear. And I think it probably needs to be, we probably need to understand that better. I understand also there's been interpretations on that. And so it's a gray area that it needs to be interpreted. And of course, you then develop some special permit sections which are more specific than the urban regulations. Well, if they're more specific, but they don't disagree, they don't come in direct conflict to the urban regulations, do those also stand? Then there's definitions. So there's sometimes a lack. I was going through the code and I said, oh, gee, what is the definition of retail? Well, it isn't there. So there are some definitions of terms that, again, the form-based coders liked to have just broad categories, and they didn't always define things. So there's those issues of perhaps conflict between the two. And what's the normal resolution of those? And I know I'm saying something here to, I'm singing to the choir, I guess you all know this. The resolution of a conflict in New York state law is first the building inspector. And if people disagree with the bill, or the applicant say disagrees with the building inspector, they appeal that decision of the interpretation to the zoning board, the ZBA. And the ZBA becomes the final interpreter of what was meant, the code. However, what I realized when Steve Goldberg sent me the later issues in item 10, that you may have reached the time where it might be time to update either the plan, perhaps the plan, or the zoning regulation, or both, in the sense of answering these conflicts. And I think if you were to choose that path, this would be a first step to talk out what the issues are. Obviously, it's the elected official, the trustee, who has control over both the plan and the code. By the way, I might mention that to you. The plan now is somewhat old, 1994. State law at that time, the planning board was the one who first adopted the plan. In New York State, before about the mid-90s, the planning board was the board who always adopted comprehensive plans. And in the mid-90s, that was changed in the state. And now the planning board does not have that power. So it's the trustees that now have the power to amend the plan as well as the code. So, and by the way, the state law says the trustees may, of course, get the views of the planning board. The planning board is still a very important board that way. And the trustees have the ability to defer to the planning board and or appoint the planning board as a board to amend the plan. But right now, the way the law has been changed, one board can also act as a board, the trustees in this case, to really look at this and be a decision maker if you care to be, and if you care to go through these issues of conflict between the two, the two areas. So with that, I don't want to be too long, so that I do want to end, though, on the idea that best practices around the state, and I get this because we also practice in the state of Connecticut and the state of New Jersey. Connecticut outright says, the Connecticut General Assembly says, and as mandated, that a plan must be updated every 10 years. In New Jersey, you reevaluate every 5 years, and then you update every 10. So it might be time to take a look. By the way, when I say reevaluate or evaluate, I don't mean to, obviously I'm a bit biased. I think in having, really participated, and our firm wrote the final plan, where we think it's pretty good, but it's old. And I think in most cases you would look at, it may make sense to, does it need some fine tuning in a couple of areas? I don't think it needs to be thrown out. I think it was well developed, in the sense, I want to give Pawling the credit for this. You spent years, and some of you spent a good part of your lives developing this plan. I think it's a good base, but I think you might want to make some minor adjustments to it, and those could predate some adjustments to your zoning code then, so that you could clarify some of these issues. That's one way to do it. The other way to clarify is you would continue with interpretations of the code by the building inspector and by the zoning board of appeals. So those are the two. I see two options here, but I think it does make sense probably to update it legislatively. So that I thought I would end here, and Lauri, turn it back perhaps for a Q&A, just a question and answer here, or a discussion of these issues.
Sure. How should we best do this now so that we're not all talking at the same time?
Oh, yeah. I would think that maybe if, people could just suggest if they have an issue.
So do we want to use the chat?
No, I think what they can do is just unmute themselves.
Yes.
Okay.
They can just unmute themselves and
Okay.
raise their hand, or just unmute themselves and start speaking.
I guess so. Any questions or
No questions?
any comments? Well, if there aren't, by the way, I don't mean to. If there are none, we can go on to 10 because the planning board chairman has given us a list of issues in his mind, and we can go on to that. But I just wanted to see if I encapsulated a little bit of history for you, and if there are any questions on it.
Lauri, I have a question.
Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, okay. You spoke of the form-based platform for the code and the way it operates. Are you feeling that is out of date, or I'm not sure I'm clear on where you think the best place to start would be if we were to update?
I think if you were to update, I might suggest that, a full update is, a year and a half process, and it's can be lengthy and it can therefore be expensive. But one way to update is to identify, which I think the trustee has had hoped to start in this meeting, to identify what the issues are. I think you'll find that they might fall in several categories. Some of them might be an issue of what controls, and you could make a decision on that. And if it's not something that is reliant on a change in the plan, you could simply make that change in the zoning code. There might be, for instance, I noticed the planning board, Steve Goldberg listed, bed and breakfast. They weren't addressed in the 1994 area. That's something that's commonly done today, but it wasn't in a lot of old codes. That's something that is not reliant, I think, as much on the comprehensive plan. It's something we could just update. You could update. I think there's things that fall into different categories. There's one, the conflict category, which should prevail, which item you're in, bulk schedule or the urban regulations. There's others where there might be some new things which you could put into the code or new definitions. So I would make that distinction. There may be things you can do now, in other words, to solve things that do not need a full update of the plan. There may be other things that I try to address your question more carefully there. I think that if designs need to be redone or the urban regulations themselves, you sort of need to preface that with some changes in the plan, because otherwise you could be challenged on that type of thing. It's just the court cases in New York saying that a zoning code should be based on a well-reasoned plan. I think you have that now, but I think you've reached a point where perhaps you should really look at a selected update or a selected update of the code.
And you also said that some of the goals had been met with the actual expectations that the plan would bring to the village. Do you feel that that's at a point that should be also readdressed? You pointed out Charles Coleman Boulevard and a couple other locations and how they were projected to look and how they are starting to look somewhat like that. Should that be revisited based on what's happened since?
You could do that. I think that's more a policy call by all of you, and you could do that if you get a plan update. That could be done. Yeah.
you would consider that maybe secondary to the other issues, though.
Well, the feeling I got, and by the way, I've only been, I don't want to overstep my knowledge here of your current feelings over this. I've been to one meeting of the trustees, and what I was told is, look, there's some areas between the urban regulations and the interpretation of the zoning code itself that people are not in agreement on. And so those things, I think, if they're identified, you're probably in a position to work toward correcting them. They might fall under two categories. Some might be easy to do. There's not a definition of retail, say. If you wanted a definition, we could provide one. That wouldn't need a master plan change. That's a housekeeping, I would call that a housekeeping issue in the zoning code.
Or an addendum, yeah.
So that could be done. There are things that could fall into the category of, you could do that in a 4 to 6 month effort, that type of effort. You still need a public hearing. You still need an environmental assessment form, that type of thing. But it's fairly expeditious to do. There are other things that if you're getting into trying to change the urban regulations, and I didn't hear that, so that's a hypothetical on my part, then you have to go into the comprehensive plan and you really have to update the comp plan. That would take a little longer.
So even though some of these issues might be, let's call them technical at this point, perhaps they could be a result of the village growing and some of the how should I say it, the expectations that were illustrated maybe need to be interpreted as being where they were hoped to be or not. That makes sense.
Yeah, I do think that you're right. That you've just raised a good issue. That Andres tried hard to illustrate things so that you could get a sense of what was wanted for property, and then he tried to write those urban regulations, but he wrote them somewhat generally and just thought, well, look, people are going to look at the drawing. They're going to be able to see it and see what was wanted. It's not to say that the drawing should be followed slavishly, but on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think the idea at the time was, hey, the drawing should pose a guide, if you will, to an actual developer of the property. And of course, at that time, the property owners were pretty involved in this. So by the way, and I will say again, that was one of the points I wanted to make. Some of the gray areas, they weren't defined in total black and white as a, well, you're the building inspector, right? You're used to seeing a area and bulk code. And look, if it says height is 35 feet, it can't be 36 feet. Right. Andres was drawing things, and to him, it wasn't a question of, well, it can't be 35 feet. It should be 35 feet or 2 stories. But to him, it wasn't, would 36 and a half feet be wrong, given his drawing? That was, left to others. Would 50 feet be wrong? Yes, it would. You know what I mean? It's that's the value of a drawing, but he hadn't meant it to be, absolutely black and white.
Well, I do understand the value of the drawings, and I think that maybe they haven't been looked at, not that they're up to date or have been considered to be what their goals were, but I'm thinking after listening to what you're saying that they could be a useful component in maybe working through some of the issues that have come up. Maybe can't see the forest from the trees type of situation has applied. Everyone's caught up in interpreting bulk and urban and a few other things, and maybe to look at what some of the projected visions were might help work that out as well.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. We could certainly we have designers, and we're not the only ones. I'm just saying we happen to have designers who do that when we develop form-based codes now. And if there's something that's out of date on properties, that could be done.
Mm-hmm. Or not just out of date, but help things be realized that they're on track, but people have been focusing on maybe other parts of that whole that whole scope of analyzing it and determining whether it's in compliance or not. So,
Right.
because I understand that based on what you're saying about the original, it had a lot of flexibility.
It did. It had flexibility.
Yeah.
And that was one of Andres's reasons for doing it that way, because he felt different sites. Well, no site is quite exactly like the other, and some of the sites varied a bit, were different in their topography, vegetation, and their location. Parcels on Route 22 he saw a bit differently than inland parcels. So, that's what created the designs.
So it would be fair to say that you could utilize some of his visions, if we can call it that, within the village. Maybe they weren't illustrated per se for a specific location, but the concept was illustrated, and that could be applied to near 22 or near the golf course or near downtown or something like that.
One of his basic ones is, what I call an open space subdivision. And of course, New York state law, as you know, allows the trustees to give the planning board authority. Maybe that's been done in Pawling already, to entertain an open space subdivision. We, in fact, went a little further in the plan. We gave a slight bonus in the plan, suggested doing that to encourage open space preservation. It sometimes meant slightly smaller lots, but you got some more open space on the site preserved.
Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say that covered everything I wanted to talk to Frank about.
Great.
Right.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? Otherwise, I was thinking we could move on to Steve's.
There is a hand raise in electronic.
That's my hand. That's my hand anyway.
I'm sorry.
Thank you. The first thing I want to say, thank you very much, Frank. This is super useful. And I'm part of my screen has Nancy Tanner on there, and I just want to say that I think that one of the things that we're doing that we shouldn't do is we're selling the comprehensive plan short, and the code. By the way, I agree there's much that can be improved, but without any doubt, I think that we're burdening it with some criticisms or observations that don't really reflect the fact that it's 25 years old, and the world has changed. We have gig businesses like Airbnbs, which change the needs of the code and the plan itself moderately. We're very concerned about Route 22 being widened and coming up like 684. There's been an enormous change in the way that properties to the south of us look. Subdivisions are no longer as popular. Large apartment buildings are less and less popular because of COVID. I could go on. The Village Gateway, would have been envisioned as one thing in an era before Google Maps and a different thing. These are all easy things to see, but I don't think, and I would just like to say that I really believe that both the plan and the code itself are not as conflicting or as perhaps unclear as this conversation might indicate, to be honest. And I think that it's a good forum to get this all out of our system. But I just want to go over before we go into these issues, because we may be able to just stick with one issue set and send everybody home. First of all, I want to make absolutely clear that there is really very little ambiguity about the area and bulk regulations and when they are or are not to be applied. The language is crystal clear. I apologize for anybody on either the planning board or zoning board or anyone in the village who ever had any lack of clarity. But you have just strengthened that, Frank, by being very specific. It's where it's applicable, right? Which means if it's a feature of the urban regulation, then it takes precedence over the bulk and area schedule. And if it is not a feature of the urban regulation, then the bulk and area schedule don't have anything to be in conflict with. And of course, they go back to being prevailing. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think that I'm surprised it was an area of conflict, but that's definitive. I would argue both in the language and in your explanation. So I want to check that one off the list. I don't really think we need to spend any time on the definitions, right? Because you found the ones that I mentioned, with the exception of the word highway. And the reason that that's so critical is because ultimately we have only one and arguably two lots that touch Route 22 and also touch the feeder on East Main Street. And so the difficulty is that if we don't define highway, then we are stuck with a urban reg for a building that is known as highway commercial, but in a latest application, unfortunately, is only in a lot that will be part of the highway if it's joined with other lots. And that's troubling. I think we need to define that, and or we need to, I think we need to define it. And I think we also need to give some thought to whether, even without a definition, if the meaning there is contiguous to or adjacent to a highway, or if it's just in the same parcel of land. The rest of the number one issues, I don't think we have any value to go over in this forum. But if you have anything to say about that with that specific urban reg, that would be great. And then we can move right on to issue number 3, really. Issue set number 3.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I will be able to answer your question on the highway, except to say at the time, I know Andres and we viewed the word highway as really referring to Route 22. There may be more permutations of that today, but I think his type 6 was written really for Route 22, from what I can see. And I think the word highway was interpreted as Route 22. By the way, the state, and Andres didn't follow, the state has a roadway classification, which we didn't get into in detail. Route 22 would be called, major arterial. Well, I'm sorry, it might be the state defines it as an arterial roadway. Something
right.
that goes from a fairly significant place to another, or connects major interstates, that type of thing. And then, they go down to minor arterials and collectors. Main Street to the state usually would be a more minor arterial, and many of the other roads would be collectors, and then local roads. Local just bringing traffic onto the collector. So I think at that time, by the way, I'd have to go back through and double check that, but I think the word highway, he saw a highway commercial as mostly 22.
Right, and that'll lead to the only other issue set that I think we need to talk about. But I want to just also take a step back, and I want to say that, the culture that I personally have, and that I think we can all benefit from if we work harder, is when we're dealing with an applicant. I think that what we have to do is, if we have issues, right, with form, that we have to look at the code first. And if we have issues, and try to avoid, in most cases, the comprehensive plan. If we have issues with either special use or Euclidean issues, we have to look in concert with the code and the comprehensive plan that suggests it. And then finally, when we're looking at either special use issues or issues where we are well outside the form and are talking about large variances, like for instance, large FAR or height variances or massing variances, then I think that's when we have to move to look at the code, the plan, and the diagrams that you mentioned. So I took that away, Frank, from what you were saying, but I'd like to say that I think as a methodology, that's always the best thing to do. because those diagrams are deeply instructive. But at first I always look to the code, then the code supported by the plan. And then I would argue that if there's still ambiguity, the diagrams, and this is my question to you, tend to offer a level of definitive observation, because those diagrams, especially those that are in the currently unused land property, are an articulation of the work of the charrettes as well as the desires of the owners.
Yeah, the one addition just I'd add is that there are the code though, and correct me if this isn't the case. I think that the urban regulations are actually part. I think they're Appendix A.
They are Appendix C.
Zoning code, yeah. So when you say the zoning code, you are including, by definition, the urban regulations. Not the whole plan, but the urban regulations are in the zoning code. So that's
right.
Yeah.
I meant other things in the comprehensive plan. And so it widens out to where we get to a place, right, where you might be within the code or you might be variant from the code, but somehow you feel like you might be in the spirit of the plan. And that's interpretive. But then if you pull those diagrams out, like for instance, the one you showed of the Johnson parcel on the east side of Route 22, which is right out my backyard, I'd love to have never seen that picture, right? Because according to that picture, right, there's like a major subdivision right out my backyard. It's actually an acre away, but that's the way I look at it, is when people get into issues of interpretation, especially issues of cohesion with the neighborhood or consistency with the plan, those phrases, which in my mind are highly interpretive, that's when those diagrams and drawings can be super useful. Is that the way you would look at it?
Yes, I think the drawings can be very useful to instill intent, and also then to understand a little bit the urban sort of regulations. However, there is also the actual, I think, and I don't want to say how the building inspector should do something or not. I would say mostly what I'll find with most building inspectors is they do rightly view their job as they have to. Their job is to interpret that area and bulk schedule. So they have to check off, first, what board does it go to? Does it go to the planning board? It should really normally go to the planning board only if the building inspector deems it as a complete, application that conforms to the code. If he deems it differently or she deems it differently, then the applicant has a right to go to the zoning board of appeals, for either an area variance or a use variance. So that would be the normal process.
Excellent. So if it's okay with you, I really, if you don't mind, I would like to turn it back to you if you could speak for a bit about the B2 district. The B2 district is a cranky district, as it were. It's unique in the village because it borders on both, Main Street and Route 22. It also is unique, I would argue, because by its very nature, it's a use change, unless the Johnsons are going to bring some cows back into the area. I'm going to say it's going to be a use change, right? It has an issue with it that is actually a larger code issue, which is in a very few instances when we issue a special use. Oh, and I should also say it's unique, that parcel, because it borders on residential and a historical site in a way that other sites don't necessarily around the village. But it also brings up, Frank, that very troubling, the one conflict that I have always struggled with reading the code, which is when we issue a special use permit for a particular site, very often that site, especially if it's in the B1 or in an R district, there are then no actual parking regulations to go with that because they're not part of the schedule. And this can be very troubling because applicants tend to just say, well, I'll use the B1 or I'll use a mashup of what I'm looking at. But one of the unique features of the B2 district is that when you assign certain special uses, right, you're then, for example, multifamily dwellings, you're then faced with the absence of a parking template. And our applicants tend to, and I think everyone will find this surprising, they tend to go to the most favorable interpretation for them. So what I was wondering is if you could explain, without taxing you too much, just the genesis of the B2 district as much as you have it on your mind, what the context was, what its purpose is, anything you can remember about small lots and large lots, because in the B2 district, the large lots are already large and the small lots cannot be made large by combining with each other. So it's an interesting distinction, and I may be taxing everyone's memory, but it clearly had an intent. And so I was wondering if you don't have anything to say about that, then I'm done speaking. But if you do, I would love to hear it.
Well, the parking, I can say the easiest thing on that is the parking. Again, the form-based coders, the new urban planners, and Andres was one of them, their almost belief, and you hear this in some places today, oh, we shouldn't have parking requirements. Well, a lot of planners would not agree with that, a lot of more traditional planners. So you had in urban guidelines, sometimes regulations, no parking requirements, but you do have them in the code, and in if I look at, Schedule C for the B2 district, you are listing a parking requirement there, 1 space per 250.
Right, but let me interrupt you to give you an example. So let's say you have that B2 space and you combine the lots, right? So we combine the lots and now we have a hotel. Nominally, this is not perfected, but we have a hotel, we have a mixed use building, and we have 2 multifamily units. So we back out the mixed use building by use, right? Because we know that that's scheduled, or we could, and say the restaurant is this many square feet, the office is this many square feet, the retail is this many, that's 38 spaces. Then we back out the hotel and we say, well, 1 space per room. Now we're at 78 spaces. What we're left with is now a square footage of a multifamily dwelling. If we grant the variance for the multi-square family dwelling, which is like 24,000 square feet, according to the code, we need 328 parking spaces, right? Because now we're back on the area schedule. You see what I'm saying? And I don't know much, but I know we don't need 328. That's the area of conflict. That's where I'm confused.
Yeah, I hadn't looked, I hadn't, intended to get into, I understand there is an application on this, on a property on Route 22.
I hadn't intended to get into it either, but there I was.
So I know that one is the old, I'm not sure what it's called today. It's the old Johnson parcel, or we referred to it that way in the plan.
Yeah,
and that's current, as I understand it, a current application. I guess before, I'm not sure if I guess it went to the zoning board for some variances, and I guess I'm not sure if it's before the planning board. So that one, I hadn't intended to get into it in detail, but I can tell you that what the plan did address Route 22 a bit, but it addresses it, in a way that is trying to say, first, it says as new commercial buildings are constructed, the villages section of Route 122, Andres saw as a unique departure from, we didn't want at that time a strip mall type of approach to Route 22. So he designed something, and I showed that design, that was relatively, I think, in our view, relatively more modest, but had mixed uses. In other words, he thought that residential office, now I realize there's some markets that have changed here. The office market has changed, and the retail market has been a changing market, but he saw this as a mixed use opportunity and also an opportunity to avoid a strip mall. So he wanted to design something or show something that it was a little recessed back from Route 22. He tried to get some areas for landscaping. As he called it, overall, he visualized Route 22 with its current width, but tree-lined as befits a boulevard, with a mix of commercial and residential uses. That's what's described in my copy of the plan. It's page 74, but it's under section 8.2, Route 22. And so that was the that was the vision of Route 22. And then he tried to illustrate that with one illustration. The illustration shouldn't be, again, seen as something, drawn in concrete. That can't, there can be other interpretations of how to do something like that. But what he wanted to do was treat Route 22 as a tree-lined, boulevard with a development on it that didn't have a strip mall sort of feel and allowed a mixture of uses so that the marketplace would work and could be a mix of residential and commercial. That's what I get out of the plan here. Now, that may not answer your detailed.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's true what you said. I think that not a feature of the drawing, but a feature of the plan,
right,
and frankly, a feature of the code reflects those visions. And the way it does is, most specifically, is to make sure that there's ingress and egress to East Main Street and some sort of sidewalk or pedestrian plan, which would belie the strip mall concept, because strip malls generally, they have a fronting and then the back areas for loading, et cetera. So I think that the code did a good job actually of doing that. I think my specific question, again, is there are two questions really, which is we are stuck in this particular area, and I assume you don't have an answer for this, but that's okay. It's a hard question, maybe without an answer, which is when you offer a special use to the B2 district, and in some cases the B1 district, you are left, or the residential district rather, you are left without a specific instruction from the code or the plan or even the drawing on how to handle the parking. And so what applicants tend to do is they tend to use either a residential part of the schedule for parking or the B1 off-street parking. And I'm not sure if that's bad or good. I simply know that it's a little hole in the code. And I think where it's emerged specifically with this application is the multifamily special use of the two smaller lots that front on East Main, because they're multifamily, right? Yeah, they're multifamily, but there's no contemplation of multifamily in the B2 schedule at that size, right?
Well, although we did see that's what's in the plan, that you would have a mix of residential, and I think I would think that a reasonable interpretation of that on Route 22 would be multifamily,
right,
and commercial. So, and I think you probably don't want try to do single family on Route 22. It's not an ideal. So I would see the mix of uses to be consistent with the plan on Route 22. The question.
Well, again, once you combine the lots, Frank, then you have a problem, because you've got East Main Street facing, and I don't want to just focus on this applicant, but you have East Main Street facing residential, but rather than it be residential, which is the way it's shown in the drawing, it's now being applied to be multifamily use. And while I have no problem giving them multifamily use parking guidance, the truth is that what's left in the plan for that special use and is just 250 spots per square foot. And so I guess my question is, when you offer a special use, right, and we have this in a couple of places, if you offer a special use, what do you take as the parking restrictions or parameters for that special use if it's not listed in Schedule C? And an example of that would be in the B2, right? Or a better example, in the R1, we have one property under application, which is for a restaurant. Do we use the restaurant parameters that are found in other districts? We can't use the restaurant. We can't use the parameters that are found in the district it's in. It's in the R1, and there are no units, right? There are no residential units. So where do we pull the parking parameters from?
And is the restaurant, I'm not familiar with those particulars of yours you're mentioning, but is the restaurant, it's in an R1 and it can exist there by special permit?
Yes.
And is there a regulation for the restaurant, how many spots a restaurant needs in the Village of Pawling?
Not in the R1. So the only place where...
Is there a general?
It's not a special permit, guys. It's a variance, just to be.
Yeah.
But a variance.
Thanks. It's a variance.
Before.
Yeah. Sorry, Dave.
I mean, normally, what a planner would do, what you would do is if there is a restaurant parking regulation, even though it may not be listed in the R1, if the board, the zoning board or the planning board, I'm not sure in this case, were to look to a regulation, they would use the restaurant regulation in the code.
Okay.
I mean, that's
in a different district, but I just wanted to make sure of that.
Yeah. And in fact, normally in many codes, I see a little bit of a difference, what you're saying here. But in many codes, you don't have the parking regulations listed by district, you have them listed by use. And so you get a parking regulation for a restaurant. That applies to everywhere in the municipality. And that's how it would normally be done. I haven't, by the way, you're asking me a question. I have, that's a really specific thing about your code. I have to look at it.
You actually answered it perfectly, Frank.
Okay.
What you said made perfect sense, which is most codes have parking regulations by use.
Right.
And our code has parking regulations by district. And so then therefore, there's bound to be a question when we have a variance or a special use within a district. But you answered the question, which is in the absence of a Schedule X, that would be parking by use, we retreat back to the use we can find in the nearest comparable district.
I think that's what a lot of boards would do. However, that determination, as you know, as I said earlier, that determination would be first with the building inspector that he said, this can meet our code in this way. And if people disagree with that, then of course it would go to the ZBA or the zoning board. But,
If I could just add, I think there's a difference too, just to keep in mind with things like variances. There's a higher level of discretion. I mean, when you talk about, I think what you're saying, Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, that using the parking regulations for a restaurant as a guide to a property that needs a variance, I believe that would be an issue of discretion for the ZBA, as opposed to where it's permitted as of right. You have to follow those regs.
Yeah, I by the way, this one is, I've learned on a site-specific issue like this, it sounds very site-specific, to be able to look at the code carefully. And of course, David, you're the attorney, so you've probably looked at this already. But I would think if this is an issue, the way to deal with this issue, if you're going to allow a restaurant in the Village of Pawling, you should use the restaurant parking regulation. But you have to make that, if that's not clear in the code, it may not be clear. That's something that I think is a type of change you can make that doesn't affect the comprehensive plan. I call that a housekeeping change. That's just a housekeeping zoning code change. If there's and those are the ones that I think are somewhat easy to make. In other words, I don't know that there would be a huge argument on that because there could be from my own partner who sometimes believes, George Jacquemar, my partner George, is a parking specialist. And sometimes he believes some of these codes have parking regulations that are tough, tougher than they have to be. I'm not saying that's true of Pawling at all. I just need to look at it. But in general, this should be an easy issue. If you set a parking regulation for restaurants in one of your zones, it's a reasonable restaurant regulation, then I would make that apply to restaurants wherever you approve them, wherever you let them go within the village.
Yeah, I think that's very useful. And again, I wasn't trying to play stump the stars here. I was just trying to make sure that we got to where you said, which is it can be a housekeeping issue if it runs into a problem. It might be useful or might not, because there are some very limited applications for us to consider having a parking schedule by use as an addendum. And like you said, it doesn't impact the code at all. So thank you.
The plan,
the plan rather. My mistake. Yeah. I'm new at this. I just wanted, I'm done with all the things in my issue.
Just quickly, I just wanted to, because I just want to make sure, because this is obviously, we got the boards here and they're going to be hopefully using a lot of what they're learning tonight with doing their jobs. That I believe what we were just talking about is an issue of policy and what you think is good policy, which sounds right to me, but it may or may not be what's currently in the code. I think what you're advocating is, that would be the thing to do. And there may be a minor fix that needs to be implemented, as opposed to, if you just want to do it, the boards may or may not have the power to do what you're talking about. That's a question of interpretation that sort of has to be looked at, as you were saying, on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah. No, that's a good
I think,
point.
David, I was just trying to get at, I think this one would be a relatively small housekeeping fix to the code.
Yeah, I think, Dave, that's an excellent point. And while we've been talking, I've been making notes. The planning board does owe the Board of Trustees, we're about 10 years late, I think. We owe them a report. And part of this report, which we all can work together on, and I can collect feedback, but I've got a very short list of very small housekeeping items. And, at a later date, when we're not taking up Frank's time, I'm sure we can all get together, go over those items and see if that's small housekeeping adjustments that are appropriate for the Board of Trustees to consider.
Okay. Is there anything else on Steve? I know that Steve had sent a list of list of issues, and I think he's on. Is Steve still on? Is Steve Goldberg?
Oh yeah, I'm the guy that's been talking so much. Sorry, it's my wife's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's under my wife's name.
Steve, I'm sorry. I guess you were there at the first meeting. I thought
I was.
I apologize. I'm
okay.
looking at the right.
You were thinking, when's this asshole going to shut up and Steve talks? But it's the same asshole, as it turns out.
I'm sorry.
I think we've covered the key things that were on my list, and I really want to thank you. This has been enormously helpful to my work, and I got a text from someone else on the planning board who indicated the same thing. So this was very rewarding.
Good.
Okay, Frank, I'd like to say thank you very much. If we've kind of covered everything, unless someone has a burning issue, Mike, were you going to say something?
No, well, just that Steve and I had some conversations, and I thought he did a great job. Many of the things that he brought up are issues that were of concern to me, and so it was great that he ran with them and kind of cleared up things. So
Good. I'm glad that this has been extremely helpful.
Yes.
I know that some of this might have been a little bit much for everyone and they need to think it through or anything like that. So if there are additional questions, certainly send an email to Jen Osborne or myself, and we will compile any questions and then send them on to Frank, and he could follow up with some other comments. So.
Yeah, anything that goes to me, if I could ask, just CC the, I guess, the village clerk or you, Lauri, just so that, anything that comes to me, it's filtered through the village.
Yeah. Yep.
I do have one question. But I thought
Okay.
I might weekend if it's not too late.
Go ahead, Nick.
It's Nicholas from the Zoning Board of Appeals. And thank you again, Frank, for your time and effort today. I really appreciate it. In looking back at item 8, you talked about resolution of conflict, and that the building inspector and zoning board of appeals would deal with that. But what is the normal practice if there are two different views between the zoning board of appeals on a particular issue and the building inspector? How does that usually work?
That one I'll defer. I'll give you my answer, but I would quickly defer to your legal counsel.
Okay.
But the answer to that is that the zoning board of appeals prevails. As far as I can, that's what I've been in all my practice. It's why you have a zoning board of appeals. I mean, the building inspector is the first interpreter of the code, but an applicant does have the right to appeal. That's why it's called the zoning board of appeals. The applicant has the right to appeal the decision of the building inspector. And so the applicant gets to go to that appointed board, the zoning board of appeals, and then you make the determination. Well, 3 different types of determinations you can make. One, it could just be an interpretation. Is the interpretation of the building inspector correct? And you have that power. And the second power, of course, is your power over variances, a use variance or an area and bulk variance. So you are the final determinant of everything in the zoning code.
Great. Thank you very much for clarifying that. That was one little point that I just still wasn't quite sure of.
Yeah. Unless David, and by the way, I've always learned to hear, I'm not, your legal counsel, so that would be a question that I'd also defer to David on. But that has been my experience in New York State.
Yeah, Lauri, this is Lou. I want to thank you for organizing this meeting. I've read the comprehensive plan. I've seen Frank's name on many of occasions. This is the first time I'm seeing him. Well, the second time actually. I saw him at the meeting and tonight. And this meeting here was a long time coming. We needed this. We're headed in the right direction, and I'm confident that we're going to iron out all these differences. And with the few housekeeping things that we have to do, I think we're on the right path. Thank you.
You're welcome. I think this has been helpful for everyone, and I appreciate everybody participating, and I really appreciate Frank being able to do this tonight because it was something that was needed. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Just want to thank you for your leadership in this, and this was a great meeting.
Thank you, Dan. All right, I'd like to then tell everyone to have a good night. And again, I really appreciate everyone participating. And thank you again, Frank. I really appreciate everything that you have brought to the table tonight.
Okay, well, thank you all. Great.
Nice to see you, Frank. Gerald, nice to see you.